Hey, it's Darren. We are just waiting on Steve to join us, but in the meantime, we're going to do a little vamping right here and say thank you to everyone who's joining us and paying attention and supporting the DLR cast. Because let's face it, Van Halen is trending. Van Halen is worldwide. Everybody's paying attention to Van Halen at the very moment because, Alex's book just came out within the last week. He's been doing media after, being pretty silent for a long time. And ultimately, we're going to take I think they call it in the corporate world, the sandwich approach to how you give the feedback, where you do the positive and then the constructive. And then you say from there, okay, but still positive. That's my take on this book, where you go and here is Steve. Steve, repeating myself here, good evening. My plan for this is to take the sandwich corporate approach to this Alex Van Halen book. Tell me if you agree if that's how we're going to approach it, where you say the positive thing and then the constructive thing and then the positive thing. Or you can go full scorched earth tonight.
No. How are you, Darren? Good to see you. I got to remember to
see you. Great to see you. Thanks to the folks tuning in. Happy sort of Halloween to those who celebrate it.
Exactly. I got to remember to hit the button that says enter the studio like 5 minutes ago. And then
my vamping skills were good. Don't you worry.
Okay, perfect.
I've hosted plenty of events where the person didn't show up whatsoever, or the person was 20 minutes late. So you go, oh, I know how to fill time. For better or for worse, I can unfortunately fill time. But, leading into this whole thing, it's very exciting. Like we can start definitely on common ground here and go, it's excellent that Alex wrote a book. Right?
Oh, yeah. Listen, I mean, I got the book the second day it came out, finished reading it last night. It was a fast read. It's 230 or so pages. Should very well be. I'm not going to tell you it broke huge new ground. I'll tell you it did. I do have some positives about it. I'll tell you that much. For sure. I definitely had some positives. I know there's been some controversy. I'm sure we'll get to about it. There's been a lot of what's the word? What's the phrase I'm looking for? I guess a lot of drama.
Controversy.
There's another good one. So I've got some positive things to say about it. I got probably a few negative things to say about it too.
Well, to give some context, if I'm correct on this, you did the print version, I did the audiobook version. So there's a chance that we picked up on different things.
Correct. In fact, actually, I know you, when we were texting earlier in the week, I didn't know you were going to just do the audio version. And you just, in very brief texts, and from what I read a couple of places, you enlightened me to a few things about that. So I'm real curious to know kind of, I guess, what I'm missing or what I may have missed. I'm not really an audiobook guy, despite the fact I live everything else very audio wise. I mean, I'm not afraid of streaming or any of that stuff, but I just still love to have a physical book in my hands.
Exactly. I went the audio route because I didn't have it in my hands from the pre-order I did. So I went, oh, it's immediately on Spotify. Oh, it's 8 to 9 hours. Sure. I'll do this in, 1 to 2 hour bursts at a time. And so I did it that way. And when I say that I'm not sure if this is different than the print, I'm certain it is different from the print because audiobooks are generally more concise. But the Brad Talinsky Facebook post, if you did the audio version, you would immediately disagree with something that Brad Talinsky said in that post. And I like Brad, and we have a mutual friend. But when Brad Talinsky in his Facebook post said, and there is the book, that proof that you have it, when Brad said, they cited 40 passages from our book with Chris Gill, and they didn't credit it. No, in the audiobook, you hear Alex go, pardon the lack of good impression here, but he's like, as author Brad Talinsky said in his book. So he did say Brad Talinsky's name in the audiobook.
Right. And I guess that's kind of the mystery for me. And for those who don't know, a big controversy exploded over the fact that there are a lot, and that was one of the first things you and I traded quotes about. I see this in a lot of unauthorized rock biographies. I don't see it so much in autobiographies. How this book was written, Alex wrote with his ghostwriter, I did not fully expect, and that is so much of it was sourced from a lot of previously published interviews and books, including Dave's book. And so I guess the big miss here for me is that and I can tell you from being in publishing, I mean, we really tried it, and publishing rock books, I mean, we really try to go the extra mile to make sure everybody is sourced and there is correct attribution. So I guess the big miss for me is, the weird mystery is for me, is if you're going to mention that in the audiobook, as well you should, why did it not make the physical book, considering if you look in the end of the physical book, there's a ton of mentions and thank yous and attribution and detail. And even in the beginning, hey, as Dave said in his book, Crazy from the Heat, it was interesting because if I have that right, I think maybe Dave's book and Steve Rosen's book there was not a...
Oh, Steve, I've got a list.
Okay, you're so thorough on this stuff. But I guess what I'm getting at is that there was obviously more places that did not get at that there was quotes from that were pulled attribution from. That there was more places that did not get attribution that did get attribution.
Well, before we continue, Suzanne, I believe it's not Susan, I believe it's Suzanne. Thank you for watching and enjoying. And wouldn't that be a copyright violation? I think under fair use laws, as long as you're attributing, I think it's fine. And sometimes, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, in the back of the book, you can give the index or your works cited page. And there you go. It is Susan, like Susan. So sorry about that, Susan. And thank you for watching and listening. But Steve, write the works cited page, or there are bibliographies usually how you get around it?
Pretty much, sure. I mean, from what I know, I mean, I'm not no expert on copyright stuff. I just know you try to give as much attribution as possible. It's what you should do.
Yes. So
there you go.
When thank you again, Susan. So when you go through the book on the audiobook, he cites each person that he quoted from. So my list, and I haven't gone over the positive things yet, but the list is Brad Talinsky and Chris Gill, a lot. Tom Beaujour's book that he co-wrote with Rich Beanstalk, The Nothing But a Good Time.
Nothing But a Good Time. Great book. Yep.
Great book. Number 3, Steve Rosen. He gets a number of sightings. Number 4, Noel Monk.
Yes,
number
of course.
5,
of course. Yes, you're right.
Diamond David Lee Roth, Crazy from the Heat. Number 6, Greg Renoff's book, Ted Templeman. Lots of citations.
Lots of stuff from Ted.
Number 7, we get a lot of Jas Obrecht. The first time that I think Alex says his name, he says it the American way, and then the later chapters, he's pronouncing it the Dutch or the German. He's like, as Jas Obrecht says, but I think he's like, as Jazz Obrecht. It kind of changes. We see that. There's Steve Bolton citations. There's Robert Lombard, who I think worked on the Jump video. And then there's a number of times when he goes, as Ed told Rolling Stone and he said it in like 80s stuff, he said it in 90s stuff. So when you're talking about at least 10 different citations, and you're saying 250-ish pages with photographs, how much did he actually write of this book? That's where I'm going.
Right. And I'm sure people, I mean, I know everybody came running to Alex's defense in some of those posts we saw at some different places. And it's not a slag. It's just a very good question, actually. I mean, let me just back up a bit. I really enjoyed the book. Yeah. I think I can quibble with some things. I mean, the fact that it took about 200 pages just to get to 1980, and then everything got wrapped up very quickly from Diver Down on. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Some really big things happened between 83 and 84, man. Yeah. You know what I mean? I was like, holy shit. So there was that. The book was, in my mind, the book was too short, left me wanting an awful lot. For sure. I expected, I said it here, I said on numerous previous episodes, when I saw the page count on this thing, before I even knew that it was just going to be up to 1984, which we learned about.
That's something I also want to address. They said book is going to be up until 1984. It's not. The audiobook version cited a lot of things that happened in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s.
Interesting. So, and then I'm real disappointed then, because it should all be in the physical book as well, because you're going to sell more copies of the physical book. That's what people are signing at these signings. And you know what I'm saying? I don't know. I think it should be equal.
For sure. And another question from Susan. She said, did he use citations in the print book? Steve, you've got the print book right there. So while you're scanning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no index. There's a ton of people listed in the acknowledgments, but then, as you said, it's throughout the book where it's as you know, so and so mentioned in his book, that sort of thing, as in Noel Monk's book, as in Dave's book. It's weird because you are correct. I mean, there is a ton of attribution in this, but so much of it was a lot of Eddie's quotes were taken from Eruption.
Yes.
Brad, and forgive me for getting the
Chris
author's name there. But yeah, that is an excellent book. And one of the things that really made me laugh was in seeing in certain places people just completely tearing apart Brad and Chris for even daring to bring this up. What killed me about it was, and there was a couple people, and I think we're both talking about the same place, the WDFA.
And we love Scott Yeager. We love
absolutely.
Yes. But.
Absolutely. But one of the things that really cracked me up with the most was the fact there was a few people on there were saying, well, Alex must know because Eddie said this. How do we know? They even said that to Chris and Brad because they wrote a fucking book from it, man. All those that in Eruption is entirely fucking 20 years worth of interviews from Guitar World magazine. Hey, we're from Guitar World. Great. Nice to meet you. Here's a tape recorder between us. We're going to do a gigantic feature about your freaking new guitar or this tour or this thing. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean,
I know
Brad and Chris weren't getting this hearsay. The amount of fucking whining, okay, really was just like, really? I mean, it kind of cracked me up. I'm like, and I almost forgot because I have lived in the fan world long enough where, oh my God, I mean, listen, I would imagine most of the people on that site are somewhere in my median age group.
Yes.
Anywhere between 45 and 55, let's say.
Yeah.
And it's just, oh my God, the freaking drama over this was just, I had to, and I don't want to sound too negative about it, but my whole thing was it was just that, I guess if I look at this objectively, did that post that Brad on there, did it come across as whining a little bit? Did it come across? I mean, a lot of people were just like, oh, he just wants book sales. And he even put it in there. Well, hey, I guess we are flattered, but hey, by the way, and the crazy thing is, I would bet you a huge number of those posters have that book. A lot of them said, I'll never read it. Well, in that case, then that's a
book burning, and like that's a little harsh.
My God, the drama. First off, if you're a Van Halen fan, and there was a good post today on there about people who put all the various Van Halen books up there, and a lot of people had, I guess, what kind of kind of the big 3 or 4, if you will. Greg's awesome book, one of the best research books. I learned more about Van Halen's coming up from Van Halen Rising. I just sat there with my mouth ajar, just like, oh my God, this is amazing. All right. There was that book. There was a few other ones out there. Dave's book, of course, we've all read. If you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure. Noel Monk's book was amazing because that was really the first insider outside of next to Sammy and Dave. But this was the first one kind of in that perimeter, right? Noel's book was pretty eye-opening. And then for me, it was Eruption because I had been reading those. I've said it before. I used to buy every guitar magazine that Eddie was in. I don't know jack about gear, nor do I care, but I wanted to hear the details about the songwriting. Hey, we did this. And so much of those interviews in Guitar World and Guitar Player Magazine, those places really covered that stuff far more in depth than most rock magazines. So,
for sure. Yeah. I find that when you talk to the guitarist as a guitar publication, because I've written for Guitar World, Guitar Player, even though I'm not a proficient guitar player, I can talk enough about gear. And thank you for that comment, Susan. That's fantastic. You're passing along the genealogy and all that. But I find that when you talk to a guitarist about gear, it winds up segueing into interesting stories. In other words, you use that as the leading point, and then you find out what actually their mindset was or what was going on. And that's why I thought that Chris and Brad's book was so great, because they got Eddie talking about even though they're talking about Guitar Gear, he wound up talking about addiction and mental health and what was actually going on. So they may have gotten some of the best interviews of Eddie Van Halen or Edward or Vard or however you want to address him over the years. So, going back to like what's positive or what's different or giving context, glad he did the book. There's differences between the audio and the print versions. But, I think that we have to consider that Alex Van Halen is a different kind of human being than any of us. Not just the struggles of their childhood and moving here and learning different language and cultures and discrimination, but a book where you're basically talking about how you're going to kick your brother's ass. And that's a
right
thing. That's not my family. Steve, is that your family? Did you threaten violence as a compliment towards siblings or family members?
No, for sure. I mean, there was a couple insights that really jumped out at me, and some of those things we knew. I mean, I had heard and read in various places that they could sometimes have a very volatile relationship.
For sure, that Sammy said that they were in the corner speaking Dutch and blah, 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 blah. But, where I was going with that, we were leading into this book hearing, it doesn't go past 1984 and it's about until the split with Dave. And that's the kind of stuff that we would hear. But when I say that's not true, when he talks about how he met his wife, Stina, and that relationship, that's mid-90s stuff. When he talks about how when we failed big and we did it on purpose, like Van Halen 3. So there's a 90s reference again. Right. And when he talks about Dave busting his nose open on the Kimmel show, that's 2010s as well.
Yeah, he did jump around back in there, but it was more referencing, hey, broke his nose and what was it, Van Halen too, and then this happened again. So I kind of get that. I mean, listen, 90% of the book, I don't really necessarily quibble that stuff, but for the most part, it was 90% of the book was really up until 1984. So, I mean, let me jump back a little bit. I mean, and give you some of the positives I really love from this book. I got a lot of really good insights. There's a lot we already knew.
Yeah.
A couple of things that at least that really came across in this book was, and we kind of knew this, but it was just reaffirmed for me, was even more so because we never really heard Alex speak about any of this stuff in decades. I mean, yeah. I was never paying attention. I don't remember ever hearing him do a radio station interview where I lived back in 1981 or whatever, when he was regularly doing this stuff.
Right.
And so one of the things that reaffirmed for me was that and he brings this up in different ways in the book, that the overdriving, the thing that drove them the most was the music. And that sounds like a cliche, but my goodness, I mean, they lived it, they breathed it, they never stopped. I mean, that just, to me, it really kind of jumped off the page to me how many times he went back to that, and also just how hard they worked. And that's a good segue for a huge positive. One of the big things that I love the most about this, that I feel somewhat, it verified for me and gave me some cool vindication, the fact that how much he's saying Dave's praises in this thing. We are the DLR cast after all, so we got to talk about that. And yeah. Man, it was a lot more than I would have thought, because in the press for years, Alex slammed Dave, if not maybe more than Eddie. I mean, when things were at their worst, it was, I mean, Alex could be pretty vicious in the press to him. And
for sure,
the fact that Dave was the first person he called after Eddie's death, just the praises he sang, especially in the beginning of the band and everything. I mean, I don't know. That made me feel really good, because we're of a time now in doing this podcast where Dave gives us more cringeworthy moments now. And I'm not even sure what the last couple videos were all about. Dance the Night Away was, let's say, just interesting.
Yeah, let's have a moratorium on actual Dave content on this episode.
No, but you know what I'm saying? I mean, again, in a weird way, there was sort of verification and vindication for me that, yeah, you know what? And the fact that he to this day believes that nothing can touch that original band. That's where the fire was. That's where the magic was. My biggest regret next to losing my brother is the fact that Dave left, and that ended the band.
Well, besides the source material, one of the biggest complaints that I have about this book is that it's almost like Al doesn't know that what is the most interesting stuff. In other words, we didn't need an explanation of brown M&Ms again from Dave's book. Like, how many pages did the brown M&M stuff eat up in the print book, like print version? 5 to 10 pages, I'm gonna assume, because on the audiobook it was like 10 minutes.
It wasn't that much, but it was enough where I was shooting through it. I'm like, yeah, I know this. Everybody knows this.
Okay, so we all knew that. Everybody in pop culture knows about the brown M&Ms. But then there was so little stuff towards the end of the book, and he goes, kind of like when Al wanted to quit in 1982. And you go, what? That did not come up. That was just a passing thing. And the drug overdose from the PCP or Angel Dust in their club days, there's so little on that. And I didn't know about their childhood law skirmishes, and I didn't know about that. And I didn't know so much about the other bassists that were there before Mark Stone. That's interesting.
Yeah, that was all interesting to me too.
We didn't know about Kevin and them playing at the wedding where they were trying to, racial integration with all that. Fascinating stuff. We got some interesting information about their community college stuff. Alex tells it very differently than Dave did in his book, because Dave is the king of going, I went to an integrated high school and we were bust. And I've spoken to people who go, yeah, that's not true. Dave has reinvented his childhood a little bit with the diversity. But I feel that the most interesting stuff got left out. When did he bottom out with the alcoholism?
Said he'd been sober for 30 years, and he talked about getting off of was it benzos, how difficult that was, but he didn't go into. I mean, I would have liked to have known. I mean, was it AA? What made you finally put down the bottle, and how did that intersect with Eddie's problems? I mean, we didn't necessarily get I know it wasn't necessarily Al's job to spill the dirt on Eddie, but the fact that Ed's problems, as we certainly read in Sammy's books, but Ed's problems were so well known with the drinks and drugs, and it was such a sad, difficult time. He really only touched on that so much. I mean, he said, yeah, we did all these drugs, did all these things together, but there was nothing really in there. Okay, yeah, everybody, him and Val had little vials of cocaine while they wrote their vows. Yeah, but I mean, there was
leaving out the most interesting stuff and just using that as the footnote. And then again, we get the brown M&Ms for a bunch of pages when we already knew that. We already knew that they didn't love Jump, or different people hated Jump. But then there was nothing about the creation of Panama or Hot for Teacher or I'll Wait and the Michael McDonald stuff. When he casually goes like, he says that 1984 was their high point and is his favorite album, and we almost called the album Animal Farm. And you go, wait, tell us more about that.
I know, that was news to me.
What? I didn't know that. And by the way, Eric Senich from Van Halen News Desk and the Booked on Rock podcast, thank you for supporting us. And that's a good point of what he got from the book is regarding DLR, is that Al didn't have a problem with Dave, quote, being Dave for the most part. He knew the importance of having a showman fronting the band.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things that's a good addendum to what I was talking about, that verification and vindication. The fact that, I mean, it's interesting because Dave always talked about that kind of that push and pull, and the fact that it was that kind of that the fact that they often didn't get along, that passion was what drove things. And that's what Al touched on too, which I found was really interesting.
Totally agreed. That is one of the first times I've ever heard an artist tell it from that perspective, that the dysfunction is why they got along. I remember Dave talking about that on the Mark Maron interview, that when he inked the original era. And I thought, oh, that's bizarre. The Van Halens don't see it that way. And it turns out they did. They were happy to be dysfunctional. It's the opposite of Metallica, Some Kind of Monster, of the band going to therapy together and talking their way through it. So that was a unique thing. And I also loved in the book, hearing that he kind of got closure with Mark Stone in a way.
Right.
Because Mark Stone is unfortunately a footnote that only people who really saw that Van Halen 2003 or so, the early years documentary. People know about Mark Stone from that, but in Dave's autobiography, he's listed as Mike Stone. And I think Mark Stone showed up at Greg Renoff's book signing and he like jammed with the band on stage, but that is a guy who unfortunately did not get his due. So the fact that, how weird is it though, that Alex maybe spoke more in the audiobook about Mark Stone than he did Michael Anthony?
That obviously that's something that really stood out. Did you count, and I should have, how many times he actually said Mike's name?
Very few. Sammy did get a mention during the Van Halen one section when Ted talked about wanting to fire Dave and replace him with Sammy Hagar, which we knew, but
there's also that quote, we had lots of other singers.
That bothers me so much because we talked about that in the last episode. You and I were talking about all the people auditioned or whether or not they knew they were auditioning.
Right.
Van Halen, but no, they didn't have a lot of singers. That's not true. How many singers did you record with? 3? Those are all the singers you had. I mean, Mitch Malloy technically demoed with them, but it wasn't released. But
right.
I
mean, technically, did they have less singers than Kiss had guitar players?
Yeah. Well, you never know with Kiss because they did have Robin Ford and all these people ghost playing on the records.
Right.
Kulick, besides Bruce Kulick.
but you know what I mean? It's the reputation, I think, preceded the reality in some cases. I was going to bring up something about the book, and I just got a little sidetracked there. But in relation to Dave, he did touch on very often, which again, kind of, I guess, solidified for me what we all really knew. And as Dave fans sometimes went, man, you hate to think that's the case, but was Dave's jealousy and the fact that he was such a spotlight hog. And I mean, but at the same time, though, it seems so petty that a guy who's leading the biggest rock and roll band in the world is going to go, fuck, Ed and Val are getting more press than me. He married a Hollywood starlet. Do you know what I mean? It just seems really ridiculous from where I sit. But could have that really been the case?
That goes on the list of things that I felt were half-truths or untrue.
Because it sounds too simple.
Well, I feel that, and the key words, I feel that, because I was not in the room, and you learn as an investigator, you never say things like, I feel that, because that'll get laughed out of courts and reports. But they're talking about how Dave was annoyed about band members not being single and that kind of a thing. And so it makes this whole to-do within Alex's book about the Valerie Ed marriage. But then the fact that Al got married twice in the early 80s and Mike got married to Sue, his childhood sweetheart, and all that, that didn't matter to Dave? What? Okay. There's just so many things that are half-truths. So, for example, when it talks about how they had the worst record deal that there was, etc., he fails to mention how they renegotiated the deal into one of the most lucrative deals ever. In other words, because he's cherry-picking the sources in particular moments, he leaves out key factors that really tell the rest of the story. So as a result of that, can I tell you there were some mistakes that are in the audiobook that...
Oh, please. Sure.
Okay. So one of the early chapters, he talks about how Jan Van Halen, it was Jan, right? Not Jan. It was Jan Van Halen because he was
always
Dutch.
Figured, yeah, that's what I thought.
Jan wanted Ed or Alex, I think, or both of them, to join this kid band, this band that other students from the school were in because they had a record deal. And then a chapter or two later, he says something along the lines, and we got a manager, this real punk kid. And then you fast forward a couple of chapters to them meeting Gene Simmons, and Gene Simmons goes, do you have a record deal? Do you have a manager? And they go, what's a record deal? What's a manager? And you go, like,
right.
A couple of chapters ago, you had a manager and you kind of knew what a record deal was. And then, around the early chapters, Alex talks about going into the Rainbow and meeting Richie Blackmore and John Bonham and almost getting punched by Bonham's security guard. Right. This was in the print version, right?
Yes. Yep.
Then you fast forward a couple of chapters and they're in Japan, and he goes, a band called Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. And you go, you just had to explain who Ritchie Blackmore is in this chapter, but a couple of chapters ago, you were saying him like he's a noun that we know who he is. So there was glitchy things like this that lead me to say this book is a great first draft. But the overabundance of source materials, whether or not they're attributed, I think that he did quote a lot of it. And then his vocal fry is horrible in the audiobook. You don't know if he was sick, if he needed a cough drop, or we just haven't ever heard Alex speak for more than 45 seconds at a clip. Because he has sort of like a Dutch accent, because I think when you come to learn a new language after the age of 9 or 10, you forever have an accent, no matter how proficient and bilingual you are. So he has that, but then he also has this old guy New Yorker kind of accent going on at the same time. And he has a gruff voice from whatever substances, presumably. Then at the same time, he sounds like he has a cough. And he mispronounces words, and it's almost like they didn't go, can we do that again? So the audiobook is terrible audio-wise. It's terrible.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I can only imagine. I mean, maybe it was just rushed out. I don't know. You know, they had a set amount of time. We have this amount of time to record this. Here we go. Because I know sometimes what I know from anecdotal and some past experiences where I work, where audiobooks, it's like, oh my gosh, this author's a great writer, but man, this is just not working. It is taking hours to do this. I mean, you're not making Sergeant Pepper, for God's sakes, but I mean, you've got production deadlines. Like, we got to get this going, man. You know, so who knows?
He mentions in the audiobook, he says, and I've been working on this book for a year, because at certain points he's talking about being 70 years old. And another part in the book, he's talking about how he's 71 years old. So that's another error or a glitch right there.
Can I bring up something that I
Please.
wished he talked about more? And he did touch on this a lot, but I would have loved to have heard more in relation to the Van Halen catalog, the songs, at least maybe from the first record, second record. I would have really loved him get into more of his drumming, because, you know, one of the things I loved about this is that this publicity tour is that it's shining a light. Some people are bringing this up. Alex is a fucking monster drummer. Yes. And I've always believed that the combination of Eddie and, of course, you know, Dave's showmanship, this almost might sound oxymoronic, but I think it overshadowed Alex's amazing techniques in drumming. I mean, it's funny because I listen to a lot of Van Halen, but I found myself playing like Van Halen 1 in this part of the book. And then I played the first 6 following along with this book. And then I'm playing it again and really listening. I've listened to all this stuff a million times, and I've always paid attention to Alex's drumming, but I wish he got into it more, because, man, there was really nobody like him. I mean, he's one of those guys where it's like, where a cover band can't do it justice. Not because necessarily, I mean, there's a lot of guys nowadays that can copy Eddie pretty good. No one's ever going to make it just like that. But you know, where people have been missing, I think, Alex. The guy is just a powerhouse, and yet he's got this finesse. He's got a swing. The guy does stuff with cymbals. I mean, the amount of sound and space that he took up, but yet not overplaying, will always forever blow me away. I don't even know if I'm enunciating this right, but
you are.
I wish he kind of got into that more and said, yeah, you know what, here on Hang 'em High, I kind of had this idea in place, and I learned this from, and because his influences, does bring up his influences, which are great. Ginger Baker, John Bonham, a couple of those guys. I brought up Hal Blaine, and I wish that he got into that more. I would have loved just a chapter just on something a little bit more linear, where it was just like, this is my drumming philosophy. This is what I always wanted to do. This, I mean, he talked about the flaming gong and stuff, and a little bit on having, you know, the why he went to double bass drums. But I would have loved to have gotten a little bit more insight into influences, how that made him the drummer he is, what he did on certain records and why, because of those influences, and some technical stuff.
Yes, and to add on to what you're saying, there's a couple of songs where Alex has an original thought, or there's a drum part that is the signature, and you could argue he really does deserve the co-write on them, like Hot for Teacher, like Everybody Wants Light Up the Sky has its part in there. It's not 20 songs that are like, it's 5 to 10 Van Halen songs that arguably the drum part you hear that and go, I know what song that is right away. And for him to, in the audiobook, there was not a second dedicated to Hot for Teacher. Was there anything in the book about that?
No.
And
you know what's interesting though? And he almost glossed over. I mean, this is what I'm talking about, where it was almost a rush at the end, where he went into a lot of details about the recording of the other albums. But 1984, I mean, maybe there was a page count maximum they had to get to a certain price point. I'm not sure, but the funny thing was, he mentions this, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, but he says 1984 is the record he listens to the most and the one he's most proudest of.
Oh, okay. So that part of the book, it stops being detailed. So the US Festival pretty much got about 30 seconds on the audiobook. He's like, and on the way to doing the 1984 album, we were really busy. We even fit in a gig at the US Festival. We got paid more than anybody else. Like,
yeah, it's funny. I just accidentally flipped to it right now. It's a paragraph. All our other albums we made in a week or two. 1984 took almost a year. There were interruptions. We went to play the US Festival and got paid $1.5 million to do it. Seemed like a deranged amount of money at the time. It was totally unheard of. And that was really it.
Yeah, what about the fact that they spent that $1.5 million back into the show, into making it a mind-blowing show that was a Showtime TV broadcast that was properly recorded, and they shot all this B-roll to pretend like the backstage, and it led to feuds with the Clash, and there was the renegotiations to get the money higher because of the Most Favored Nation stuff with Bowie, and how they had to fetch Dave out of vacation, and they didn't know if they were going to get to him. There's so many interesting things about that. But when I talk about the half-truths in this book, the audiobook had a lot about how much they hated music videos and how much that was Dave's thing, and the Pretty Woman music video was X, Y, and Z. And you go, what about the Oakland 81 music video? What? Those
the Holy Grail.
Not only were those not just live performances, but they had to shoot extra shots, which they merged into it, where you could tell. I think it was Ralph from Steel Panther. I'm sorry, his gimmick name, Michael Starr, who told me that you could tell that the hairstyle and the clothing is different, and it was because Dave didn't feel they got certain shots. So Oakland 81, I think they taped 3 or 4 songs from that. And of course they lip synced the whole first album for a music video. And so that's a half truth. And then he really passive aggressively knocks Charvel Guitars for stealing Ed's guitar design. And we talked in the last episode about how, and Tripwire, I see your comment, I'll put it up in a second. But what they were saying about Charvel is just, oh, they copied us and we had to lawyer up and that kind of a thing. And we were talking in the last episode about how Charvel, the story of Van Halen and Charvel basically is half of a documentary, and mind-blowing in that they thanked Charvel for giving Ed some spare parts for a guitar, which he built into, I think, the Bumblebee one that we see on the back of Van Halen 2, or maybe it was part of the first Frankenstein guitar. And they thanked Charvel in the back of Van Halen 1, and then they worked with Ed on different things, and they built Michael Anthony a bass. That's a lot different than the story of, well, they did these copycat guitars and we had to sue them. It's just a little different. And
yeah, you know, as far as things that are missing in here, the fact that even though, you know, it is mostly all about 1984, but you did, as you mentioned, they do mention a couple things here and there. Nothing at all about the 2007 reunion. How much, considering how much he loves Dave and that original band, was it nothing about Wolfie being in the band? How much fun it was to play with him, and how great and how happy that made my brother.
or that they were filming those sessions through Andrew Bennett, and some of that has emerged on YouTube as of this year. And nothing about that kind of stuff. And when we look at the Gene Simmons section, after Eddie had passed away, I remember Paul Stanley had done an interview how he saw Van Halen the night before and told Gene to see them. Do we believe that? I would believe that. Paul's known to be self-serving, but not a liar. And so that's
True.
totally out of that that scenario. It's because if you think about it, as the story goes, they were actually going to check out the boys who basically became Dokken, and nothing but a good time. I think the source material for that.
Mick Brown is quoted a couple times, who became the drummer in Dokken, and sure.
Yeah. And then, going back about what is not said about 1984, he's so anti-Ted Templeman throughout this book.
I was just going to bring that up, my friend. In 1984, he does get into Ed's relationship with Don Landy and how that progressed, how they made, and then Ted was not happy with so much of this stuff, and the power was ceding away from Dave and Ted to Ed because Ed was in control of all the recording. So
wouldn't the most perfect thing, and thank you, Susan, maybe I thought that there was going to be a sequel, but I don't know. And back to you, Tripwire, for a second. Light Up the Sky, you're right. He's overshadowed by Eddie, but hey, what a standout track. I say that of all the torching he does of Ted, then why didn't he lay into him about I'll Wait and the Michael McDonald thing? Because that was a case of Ted Templeman forcing a co-write on Van Halen, which they'd never done before. And ultimately that led to some legal recourse because Michael McDonald wasn't credited. All the things that we hear, Ted made us do this and this and this, which I take a little bit of issue with, because I think that sometimes a person does know better. And this book talked as if Dave entirely wrote the lyrics to Jump, but there's been other accounts that say, no, Ted guided that a little bit. So you have to make up your mind. Was Ted a control freak taskmaster, or was he letting Dave do whatever he wanted at any given time, but just hard on Eddie? It doesn't make sense to me, this portrayal that he was such a taskmaster all the time, because I get it that he was an executive at Warner Brothers and at the same time producer, but wouldn't you at the same time go, look at the number of hits this guy has. He himself is a musician in his own right. Maybe he knows a thing or two. That's just my take on it, Steve.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, I think there's some things missing in that interpretation.
And that was a bad seltzer swallow. Leave that in the post. I don't mind looking like a spaz. But Daryl, thank you for listening. Good to see you again, you fellow Long Islander. He says, no
good point
about Ed and Al playing in demos for Kiss during the Love Gun era, or Ed toying with the idea of joining Kiss in 81, 82. Now, my thinking on that one is when he mentions towards the end, very passingly, like the time that Ed almost quit in 82. And we've heard stories about Gene Simmons saying that Ed wanted to join when Ace was on his way out. And Gene, when he was promoting the Kiss, the Gene Simmons Vault, which I got to interview him on, he was happily talking about the Ed and Al stuff. But the way that we read this book, it's like Gene didn't get us a record deal. It was over. But the reality is, no, they did see Gene. They did.
Well, Daryl brings up a really good point, because he does go into some detail about Gene and recording. Why wouldn't you just go, and it all, even though we didn't sign with Dave, guess what? We had what we thought. I'm sure they thought at the time, holy shit, this is really fucking cool. We're playing on Kiss demos. And then when it comes out, wonder what their thoughts were. It's like, well, shit, we could have played better than that. Or do you know what I mean? This didn't just happen in a vacuum, all interrelated. And I'm sure at that moment, must've been a really cool. I mean, Al was raving about going to New York and how cool that was, and going shopping with Gene and all that. Right. I mean, it must've been doubly as cool to go, fuck, we're doing demos, man, and then to end up, and the demoing songs that ended up being on Love Gun. I'm sure at the time when they were demoing it, they didn't know what was going to happen with those songs, but 6 or 8 months later, whatever it was, going, hey, holy shit, we played on those. No mention of that at all.
No, nothing like that. And
Yep.
Ace Frehley is claimed that he was friends with Eddie, and that Eddie maybe was influenced for the finger tapping from it,
Oh
which
God, please.
is
Don't I
funny.
just
Ace is just being funny. We can just say, but yeah, I think that that is another case, Steve, where you go, does Alex not know what the most interesting stuff is? Because there's always going to be a big overlap between Van Halen fans and Kiss fans. You'd kind of want to clarify
I don't even
what
think
was.
so much it's what that overlap is. I just think it's a big part of the story. I
Yeah,
mean, because surprisingly, a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people do, because it's never really as talked about. It's never really talked about from the Van Halen brothers that they played on Love Gun demos. Gene talked about it, right? Did you
yeah.
ever? I don't know if they ever talked about it.
I don't think so. And another issue I had with this book, and I'm sorry to keep piling on, because again, I'm
Yeah,
glad
can we
Alex
preface
wrote
this
the
by
book.
saying this book was really fucking enjoyable? I did love it.
I enjoyed it. I just expected a lot,
I
saying
expected a
this
lot
guy
more.
hasn't spoken a lot.
Yeah.
So I didn't think that
I am thrilled that we got it though. And I am not disappointed at all. It's just as hardcore fans. I mean, all those people that were just so up in arms about any sort of criticism about this book. Man, I mean, to a person, was any of them a little bit disappointed that these things weren't in there when you're that hardcore fan? It's hard not to be. I mean, it's hard. We're huge fans. We know so much about this stuff. We want so much more information.
if
And
there
when
was
you have an opportunity to do it, the only person other than Sammy to write a book, man, and one person will never write a book because he's not around, and another person will probably never write a book because he just doesn't want to, and that's not him. Michael, I'm talking about.
Yeah, to rudely interrupt you, I was disappointed that certain people didn't get a single message, a mention in the audiobook. So there was no Pete Angelus, who is obviously very instrumental. There was no Ed Anderson, who is defending Dave to this day, and Van Halen to this day in Scott Yeager's Facebook group, the WBFA.
Sure.
There's no Dugan kind of stuff. And you go like, these people were the Van Halen original crew and management team was very, very, very important. We get a lot about Greg, his quote unquote associate, who unfortunately took his own life, which is very sad to say the least. We get some stuff about Noel Monk, but there wasn't much about the original crew, unfortunately. And if they're going to talk about how, we were a gang, we were a family, we were all in this together, that crew really did keep things going.
Well, I can tell you it's interesting. The acknowledgments in the physical version are really interesting. Unfortunately, they're not in alphabetical order, but I can't tell you Eddie Anderson is in the acknowledgments.
He is, and he also incorrectly thanked Ross Hogarth twice. Did you see that?
Yes. And you know what else is also interesting? Terry Kilgore, not mentioned in the book, but is in the acknowledgments. So I found was interesting, considering he came up with them. And there was that argument that Terry was a hot shot and Ed copied him, which I don't buy for a second. But
yeah, that's a Dave story.
The other thing is, getting back to the drumming stuff. Can I read you a list of drummers that he gives acknowledgments to? Jim Keltner, Levon Helm, the amazing and awesome Simon Phillips. I'm adding that adjective there because I love the guy. Billy Cottam, Hal Blaine, Buddy Rich, Ringo Starr, Dave Clark, Louis Belson, Art Blakely, Max Roach, Elvin Jones, Joe Morello, Ginger Baker, Keith Moon, John Bonham, Kenny Aronoff, Mike Porcaro, Terry Bozzio, Mike Portnoy. So he knows he's familiar with recent Carmine Appice or a piece, depending on the day and your mood. Bill Bruford, Vinnie Colaiuto. I mean, it's a who's who of drummers here. And yet we didn't get why are those people acknowledged? I'm assuming you love their drumming. Why do you love it? I mean,
let's face it, Mike Portnoy, Long Beach, New York's own Mike Portnoy was more important to Van Halen's legacy than Michael Anthony, right?
Say what?
No. I can't justify being that age and still holding grudges when everything worked out okay, where you're, you found your soulmate or your partner, and you've got your kids and your grandkids, and you've got the money, and everyone loves you, and you still have that axe to grind with Mike and Sam. I thought he could have just given 2 pages, that give 3 pages of the Brown M&Ms retelling of the story, to going, with Mikey, you guys just don't understand.
Hey, wait, I'm going through these acknowledgments, and again, they're not in alphabetical order. I'm looking for Michael's name.
No, he's not thanked in there.
He's
And
not
thank
in
you
there.
for listening, Susan. And Daryl, you were correct. He only says his name maybe 10 times tops.
Dave, of course, is down here, of course, and Nathan Roth, as is, of course, Wolf. And, he mentions his family, Stein, Eric, Malcolm, Wolf, Ed, Jan, and Eugenia Van Halen. Irving Azoff is up in the second line in the acknowledgments. Joe Walsh, that's interesting. Mo Ostin, Ted Templeman. Mo Ostin, Warner Brothers executive. That's interesting. Matt Sensio.
So I get the vibe that.
But Michael's not it. Jesus, man. What?
He didn't pick Mike or Sam.
And no Sammy. I mean, wow. And, man, it's so interesting, dude, right?
I have to take things.
Robin Williams gets a shout out.
Yeah, there's more deceased people thanked in this who obviously will not be seeing the book. But, you couldn't just take a nice approach and go, Mike, I know I'm mad at you, but you were one of the original 4, and thank you. Nope. It really is such a bad look about holding grudges like this.
I'll tell you, it's interesting because getting back to a couple of Dave things here, and I just want to read a couple of quotes I found really interesting. One was when there's a portion in the book, 152 to be exact, where they talked about the amount of women on the road. And I thought it was really interesting what he said. He said, everything Ed and I did with women, we did in the spirit of mutuality. Am I pronouncing that right? We weren't looking to exploit other people. Yeah. And he brings up here, and this is true. If you listen closely to Van Halen's lyrics, Dave once said on Good Morning America, good attribution there, you won't find one sexist lyric. You won't find one victimized sort of thinking. You won't find that victimization tact of thought. And then Alex adds, that's the truth. And then he meant here, he talks a good game, but did Dave ever really, in italics, have a girlfriend? Not that I can remember.
Correct.
That stood out to me. That was just very interesting. He's the only guy in Van Halen who never got married or had kids. Why? I'll let him tell you. And then he takes a quote. I expect that I have not wound up with a significant other because I'm not happy with me. Always something new to prove, he wrote. Always something new to challenge. Always a new treasure mountain to climb. And that was it on that little passage there about Dave's relationships or lack thereof. I just thought that was interesting, if not so much telling. And then here's one other thing I want to read to you, which just really hit home for me.
Yeah.
Towards the end, he said, and talking about Dave leaving the band, the 2 events are not of the same magnitude, but the feelings that I experienced when Dave bailed, of unfairness, of anger, loss, and bafflement with the workings of the universe, were like a preview of the oceanic grief that came over me when my brother passed. And there was that familiar sense of a terrible outcome somehow happening both incrementally and abruptly. Don't get me wrong. There's no comparison. The first thing is a paper cut. The second is getting your head cut off. After Dave quit Van Halen, we moved on. It wasn't the end of the world or even the band. In terms of my brother, it's taken about a year to write this book. It's been almost 4 years now since he died. But that really hit home. The feelings that I experienced when Dave bailed, of unfairness, of anger, loss, and bafflement with the workings of the universe. I mean, agree. Dude, I'm just amazed by the fact that, not amazed, that Dave leaving just was fucking rocked their world so hard.
Steve, tap me in, tag team match.
Go ahead. Okay. Take me back to reality, man.
There's a thing that's been floating around the internet for years now, and it's never been authenticated, but for somebody to have made a fake contract with fake 80s fonts and fake contact information and all that, it's just not possible. This is when I say that this book is full of half-truths, there's a document that most people have not seen or heard about, but it's about the final shows with Van Halen scheduled for 1985. And I believe it's supposed, I'd have to relook at it. Somebody sent it to me. It was supposed to be at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and meaning that Dave's people were proposing a farewell to Van Halen thing, because the plan was he was going to go off, do the movie, do these shows. He left Van Halen, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and he was going to be back a couple of years later for the reunion and all that. So when Alex does this whole Dave quitting Van Halen thing, this is further perpetuating this rumor that Dave quit Van Halen. Dave did not quit Van Halen. Dave was fired, and there was bad miscommunication, just like how Sammy did not quit Van Halen. Sammy was fired, just like how Gary Cherone did not quit Van Halen. Gary was fired.
Okay, so what about the infamous April 1st, where Dave and Eddie met at, was it at Ed's house, and they cried and they parted ways? I mean, what's the story about that? Alex doesn't go into that.
So when I say
at least not with much detail, if I recall, certainly not with very little detail.
The book is full of half-truths, and part of the problem is because it's sourced from, and I think we counted 10 different things towards the beginning of this episode when I was naming, Talinsky's book and Beaujour's book and Steve Rosen and Noel Monk and Dave and Ted Templeman's book with Greg Renoff and Yaz Obrecht and Steve Bolton and Robert Lumbard and all that. It's like Rashomon. How do you say that? Rashomon?
Rashomon, I think, yeah.
Where there's this one event that happened, but everyone saw it from a different perspective and all that. And the way Alex has written this book, he's putting everyone's recollection of the different events plus his own, which I don't. Now, I'm not alleging that he was messed up all the time, but he was messed up all the time. I don't think he remembers a lot of what happened. I don't think
he was drinking. He was drinking. At one point, he says in the book, he was drinking sun up to sundown.
Correct. And that's why when Dave annoyed us towards the beginning of this year, when he did those podcasts that were slagging Wolfgang and Al and talking about the industrial sized refrigerators full of 40s for him to drink, and that's what he's going through on a daily basis. I don't think that the kind of person who's pleasing the ladies and entertaining all comers after going through 2 divorces in a short period and is an alcoholic and is burnt out from the road, I don't think they're paying attention to all the intricacies while, writing and putting together an album. I have to imagine a lot of the stuff that he talks about, he processed later on or he heard about later on. That's where I'm going with all that. So the whole Dave quitting narrative, I still don't believe it. So when he says, and I talk about the half-truths, when he slags Dave's movie, Crazy from the Heat, towards the end of the audiobook, it might be different in print, but he says and no studio ever wanted to make it, and no studio picked it up. No, Dave got a huge settlement. The movie didn't get made, and he got his director's fee, and I think further damages from not doing it. And it was something stupid like a $10 million director's fee that he was getting because he was so famous at the time. If you got paid that much money to not do something, and it was only going to be a little bit more to then do it, I think you would just take the kill fee and go home, because that's what he did. So I look at that, and then I look at the whole 1985 farewell tour shows that most people don't look at, and I really don't think that Dave quit Van Halen.
Well, and I had mentioned it because I just could not recall because I'm getting exhausted here. But Alex does not talk about Eddie. He doesn't really go into how he kind of gloss over whatever may have actually, was there. Did Dave and Ed meet? And Dave, I mean, that's not even mentioned at all. And he has, there's an interesting sentence here. He called it, and he said, "Rage is always there for me, and I had plenty of that while Dave was peeling off from the band." I just thought that was an interesting turn of phrase there, and then he said, then he quotes Dave in an interview, when I left Van Halen, it was not something I was delighted to do. Dave said a dozen years after he quit the band. I was not celebrating. I was not relieved. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. And that's Dave's quote. And he does say, hindsight's 2020. At the time, David got himself a film deal with CBS, and he was convinced his career as a writer, director, actor was going to make his start in the music business look dull by comparison. Then the film deal fell through, and he never got another one. So, I mean, Dave was saying, I quit.
I don't think so.
Again, did not shed a lot of light on all that. And here it is. It's 226 pages, the book is, before the acknowledgments. And that passage I was reading you there about him leaving the band was on page 218 and 219.
Yeah, so it
was like, holy shit, we got to wrap this up and fill this all up.
Yes.
Put this all together.
That's where my mind is going with all that. And so, another section that I think is full of half-truths, which super bothers me, is the thriller / Dweezil Zappa section.
That was, I had some bones to pick there. I was curious about.
So I'll give mine and then you give yours and you tell me I'm wrong about this. So he's talking about how you don't go outside of the band because, this is our band and it's what we do. And you go, okay, so if it was such a big deal about Thriller being an outside project, it was such a big deal. Well, here's a list of projects. And by the way, you didn't mention the Brian May Starfleet project, which also happened around then. If it was such a big deal and it was the cardinal sin to go outside Van Halen. So there was that Sammy Hagar album from '86 that Eddie played bass on. There was that Sinatra music video where Eddie and Dave make that cameo, which came out.
He does bring up the fact. Sorry to interrupt, but he does mention the Nicolette Larson album that he was uncredited on.
There's the 1983 TV movie, The Seduction of Gina, which he helped score. The Wildlife. There was Back to the Future in '85. There's the Letterman Panama appearance in '84. There was the Hank Williams music video where they make cameos. There's the SNL appearance where he's on with G. Smith doing Stomp 7H or whatever it's called. If it was such a big deal for Ed to step out of the band and that was a cardinal sin, he sure didn't stop it at all after Thriller. No.
I mean, that whole Thriller thing, I really didn't know that he was, well, I didn't know at all that that has apparently been burning his butt for 40 years.
Yeah. So I go back to this whole thing where I go, he's cherry picked a narrative where he's been taking all these different things from different people's stories and kind of okay, we can go in that direction and that direction and that direction. But I also feel as if his co-writer wrote and outlined the book after reading all this, created a story arc, and then went, what did you think about this? And wove it in the commentary. What do you think about that? And wove in the commentary. Meaning that the co-writer outlined the book, figured out his color commentary, put in, and that's the book. Am I insane for thinking that?
I don't think you're insane. I do want to get, I don't think you're insane. I do want to get to a comment Daryl had here. Don't know if you guys talked about this already, but do you think Al saying he was addicted to painkillers after the Balance tour is reason he was almost entirely absent from VH3? I think that tracks. And Daryl brings up a really good point because this is what I wanted to, it reminds me of something I wanted to mention. And that is he talks a little bit about it, but I mean, and I was reminded of this again when I saw photos of the Q&A he did with these Al's Got a Cane. But man, his body, he mentions breaking that it turns out he broke his neck. But I know he went through just through the years, especially the last 20 years, let's say prior to the 2007 tour, I think, where he was, his body was, it took a beating, man. He talks about how he didn't know when he was younger that is, your body won't always bounce back. But I don't know. I would have loved to have heard a little bit more about some of the physical ailments and did that, when did that start coming in? Do you know what I mean? In relation to the injuries he had, because I know, does he mention the book? He had some major surgeries. His back was a fucking mess. I think there was for a long time he couldn't play at all. I wish he got into that a little bit more.
that is definitely a lost end. You know, when you talk about the recovery from alcohol, the recovery from painkillers, how did he kick this stuff? Because that could be inspiring to somebody. That could also be really interesting in general. A lot of autobiographies I've read where they talked about what their bottoming out was and how not only they knew it was time to fix it, but how they fixed it could be the highlight of this whole story. And it's totally glossed over. He only really mentions it because it's about how he met his wife and how he got his wife to take him back. And
I kind of like that. It was good. It was good to learn that about him. I kind of like that. I mean, he just kind of glossed over the first two marriages, right?
Yes.
I mean, just like, and I guess maybe, you know, I mean, I guess maybe when you get married for a third time and that's one that really sticks. And I guess maybe you can't help but maybe gloss over those other two. And maybe you don't want to, maybe there's no dirt to spill there and that's what it is. But I'm glad he did talk about Stein and how he met her. I thought that was really cool. And that was some insight that nobody knew, was not previously public. And nor was him recovering, getting off benzos and all that. But again, he didn't talk about how he beat alcohol, because I would think that was a harder, as difficult as a struggle, considering, I mean, the guy started drinking when he was a kid.
Yeah, which he does talk about that.
Yes.
So there's all these instances, I can't speak, about how he started the thing, but never about how he finished the thing. Like, so he meets Gene Simmons, but not about his last interaction with Gene Simmons. And so another thing that bothers me a little bit, and I say it lovingly bothers me, the book has the last song that him and Ed worked on together, recorded together. So we hear that. Okay, how about some context?
There's no mention.
When was it made?
Right.
Was Ed sick at the time? Was it intended for a Van Halen release? Was it intended for a greatest hits? Was it a leftover from Twister? Like, what is this thing? No context. Wouldn't that be a lot more interesting than hearing the Brown M&M's tale again?
Yeah, I would have loved to have heard. For instance, it's kind of common knowledge at this point that what's in the vault, there's really there's not a lot of unfinished songs. There's hours worth of noodling and jams and half-baked ideas, some other things here and there. We're rolling tape all the time. I would have, he talks about playing all the time, all the hours they spent in 5150 and jamming all that. But okay, doing what? What came out of that? I mean, even just say there's not a lot of finished song. We didn't finish a lot of songs because we were fucked up, or which I'm sure it was part of the reason. And I mean, just give us a little bit more context, a little more details about what those hours in the studio were like, because there's that one anecdote in the book where they played for, I think was after their dad died, they played for hours and hours and hours and Michael was there. Right? Did you catch that part in the audiobook? I never knew that, but I would have loved to find out a little bit more about what they played. Okay, now fast forward a bit, they make 5150, and the hours and hours that they played, was it just him and Ed? I always got the impression that for the most part it was just him and Ed. Before Wolfie came along.
I wouldn't be surprised if Matty Bruck was involved. He was kind of Ed's right-hand man on and off for decades. And Daryl, I don't know who is Mike. That's funny, but there's just so many things that would have been more interesting to find out. How does he feel about the Dave Jim Dandy stuff? What is in the archives? He talked about the relief of not having to do a cover on, I believe, the Fair Warning record. Yet supposedly they tracked In the Midnight Hour, the Motown song or the Wilson Pickett song for 1984, but we've never heard it. So why did they do a cover? How did he feel about that? What's left from that album? Because if you worked on it for that long, yet it's a 9-song album with an instrumental, it's not that much output. So, I'm disappointed unless there's a possibility of a second book, but the Alex book is not the best Van Halen thing that came out for me in the last week and a half. But is there anything that we missed from your list?
No, I mean, I I hate to think that we sounded really negative. I'll tell you, the first like 70 or so pages to me was really eye-opening. I really loved it. How they talk about forming the band. He really gives a lot of details all about Dave, which a lot of this we knew, but I was just thrilled to kind of read this stuff about, you know, he mentions Dave didn't fit in anywhere. The guy was just too out there. They started giving him clinical treatment for hyperactivity when he was 9 because he was so wired and he never shut up. Yeah, we basically knew that.
We knew all that from Dave's book.
But it was just cool to hear it from Alex and how they, you know, how he got into the band, how hard he worked. You know, and he does make the mention of the fact that here's what Dave brought to this band, which, I mean, how much he added, the showmanship, but also doing these other songs, because this is what the clubs needed to hear. And for them to really start getting some traction out there. I really loved, and again, a lot of it, most of it we knew, but I really loved the stuff, how he goes into, he took a lot of care and detail to talk about the way he talked about Dave, how he got into the band, and how the band really just kind of the metamorphosis they took as they, you know, after with Dave joined the band and prior to them getting signed. There was just a lot there. I just really enjoyed reading all that.
I again feel that he zeroed in on the stuff that didn't matter, that we already knew. And
I did not know. I'm reminded of this again. This was what I loved about some of. I wish they got into more of the musical stuff in the beginning, but I did not know the first song they played once Dave was in the band was "It's Your Thing" by the Isley Brothers, because that's what he wanted to do. It wasn't Zeppelin, it wasn't Deep Purple, it wasn't like any of the shit we grew up on. Clearly, Dave was from a different planet, a different musical dimension than we were. I don't know. That to me just. We knew bits and we knew a lot of stuff. I never knew it was an Isley Brothers song. Maybe Dave mentioned that somewhere along the line. Maybe it's in Crazy from the Heat, which oddly enough, I think I've read twice, but haven't read in about it in at least 10 years. So I need to get back. I tend to read my favorite books several times in a row. And for whatever reason, that one I just never read more than twice. Several times, I should say. So
I didn't realize that they'd recorded some of an album in France. That I had no idea about.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, so again, that could have gotten like 15 pages. They were in Europe a lot more than we realize as a result of this book, because the part where he talks about the video shoot that they did with the dinosaur in
right
that country, and you know, the Dave busting his nose there, it sounds like the co-author just found these videos on YouTube and goes, what do you remember about this, what do you remember about that? That's how that all read to me, because they just singled out the Loss of Control video and I think this is love or whatever it is. But I would want to know, what other videos does he remember filming? And the answer might be none of them, because they were tanked and jet lagged.
That's, you know, maybe that's kind of the overarching theme to all of this, is that you drink as much as he did, and then the painkillers on top of it. I mean, there's got to be a lot of stuff that's kind of hazy out there. And
yes.
And I think he could have touched even a bit more on that. And also how, again, it happened simultaneously with Ed's addictions, and he barely touched on Ed's stuff. So, I mean, it gave us there could have been a lot more insight to be had without spilling the dirt, which I think there's still some reticence there. I think maybe part of it is he also wants to protect his brother's memory. There's a lot of dirt out there about Ed. If you're his brother, do you want to add to that by saying, you know, the way Sammy's description of Ed, which everybody saw on that tour, but oh my God, kind of got into it. I mean, everything from, you know, the body odor to the fact when his hair was up, you knew he was doing crack or whatever the fuck it was. You know what I mean? I mean, we all went there like, holy shit, he is spilling the tea, man. I don't think that was, I think at some point, maybe there was a subconscious thing where, I mean, obviously he would never do that to his brother, you know? So I think there would have been a fine line. There was a fine line for him editorially to, out of sheer love, protect that legacy a bit and not, you know, put all that dirt out there.
And Daryl commented about the Oakland 81, which we touched a bit about.
Yeah, you did mention
before,
it. Yeah.
But I think in general, when you talk about the archives, we don't assume that there's a lot of finished songs,
Well,
but
everybody says there's not.
everyone says they're not. But somebody tipped me off to one of, I think in 2012 or 2013, somewhere around then, when they played Madison Square Garden in New York, it was properly videoed, that it was intended to be some kind of a release. So I'm curious if there are shows that were properly recorded, like if there's videos in the archive, which leads me to, if you have nothing further about the book, the coolest thing to me that came out in the last week and a half.
I think we're good on the book. I will say, I'm going to give a final review here. 2 thumbs up. I'm happy I got it. It was an enjoyable, if not very fast read. Left me wanting more, but when I think about it objectively, most books I read about bands leave me wanting more. I got a good amount. There could have been a lot more to get.
When you put it that way, it did leave me wanting more because it left out things. And if he does a part 2, hopefully he starts citing DLR book as one of his sources, as author Darren Paltrowitz said about. But what I think is really cool is the person who anonymously leaked in the past week and a half 2 of the Worcester shows from the '84 tour and 1 Toronto show, and they're perfect soundboards. Have you heard these? Yes, Daryl.
No, I saw him floating around. I haven't had a chance to listen to him yet, but you mentioned it. Who from 82? You said 84, and I was going to say I thought that was 82, and Daryl mentioned 82.
It is 82.
Interesting they pop up,
but
interesting they pop up now, right?
Yeah. Who? Where did these come from? Why did they wait 40 plus years? And it's fantastic. It's really separates the instruments. And so you really do hear Al's drumming. You really do hear Ed's guitar. You do hear some botched backing vocals at times, but it reminds us of why we love Van Halen. There's no drama in listening to these soundboard recordings of these shows of a band at their peak. That makes me remember why I love Van Halen a lot more than this book did.
Yeah, I mean, at least with Dave, well, I'm sure with Sammy too. I mean, of course they had some bad nights, but they were so on it, so well rehearsed, and they were true to the recordings, yet also there was so much fire and energy. Do you know what I mean? I think you'd be hard pressed to walk out of any Van Halen concert when they were really, really on going. And it's funny because Alex mentioned the book. Hey, because there's no internet, San Antonio wasn't that bad. We'll get them tomorrow night in Albuquerque or whatever it was. I mean, but I bet you the people walked out of San Antonio going, fuck, that show was amazing.
And A. Grant, summary, the book needs another 500 pages. Bret the Hitman Hart's autobiography was like 500 pages. And that might have been too much. But I think when you think of how long Al has been prominent and influential for, it really could be a legit 500 or 600 pages. It could be 800 pages, I'll say, if it was divvied up into 300-page volumes. I know my math is off of that one. Steve,
and Dave's original. Well, I was just going to say Dave's original draft of Crazy from the Heat came in at like, Jesus, 700 pages or something. They had to edit that thing down tremendously.
Yeah, I just think that he did himself a disservice by going, this is my book. Whereas had he gone, this is childhood until 84. Volume 2 will be 85 to 99 when I kick painkillers and I met the love of my life and rebuild and learned how everything happened. And then Act 3, the revitalization and me playing with my nephew and my brother's final years. If he divvied it up into those 3 things, I don't think any of us would be complaining.
If only. There won't be a volume 2.
I mean, Don Rickles had a volume 2 of his autobiography, and it was horrific. It was him writing letters to historical figures. It's like, Dear President Lincoln. Well, okay, that was maybe the worst second book in a 2-book deal I've ever read. Artie Lang, I think had started a third one that was going to be terrible, but the first 2 were great. sometimes there's a good second book and sometimes there's not. I wouldn't want a second Vince Neil book.
At the age of 70, there's not another book coming. This is it.
If it is, to everyone who got to meet him at these signings in New York, New Jersey, those photos are fantastic. In the We Don't F Around Facebook group, they had wonderful photos, and it's great to see that he was so nice and receptive to everybody on site.
You know what I'd love to see, if not official from Alex, or God, it would be great from Dave.
What's that?
But kind of I love that Neil's say
Lowe's
it with
Hours,
me. Thank you. That big 1978 to 1984 big photography book that man, that book's incredible, right? So when that first came out, it was like there was so much nobody had seen, a lot of candidates, some great, amazing stuff in there. I would love to see that sort of, kind of an archived photo book from Al with his notes and, not looking as no dirt, just, hey, these were some, do you know what I mean? Or from Dave, my goodness. I brought this up before, but there was a while that during 2007, the reunion tour, where if you went on davidleeroth.com, the backstage and live photos, but the backstage, that great shot of him doing stretching and Eddie, there was some really cool candidates there of the band. I would love to see from any era, but some big official sort of, coffee table size gallery sort of, photos you hadn't seen. I think that would be really cool. Because think of the stuff where it's like, we've seen some of these photos over the years. There's a lot of them out there, but those massive stage sets they had, right? There's that great picture of Dave from the back of, from the Dave's Greatest Hits, where he's leaning up against that gigantic wall of freaking sound, whatever, wires and all that shit backstage. You've seen those massive photos of those huge photos of the Fair Warning stage set in 1984. I'd love to see just about a lot of that stuff there. I'm sure there's photos out there from sound checks and some candid stuff on the bus and backstage shit. It wasn't the internet time, but everybody had a freaking camera.
And then, as Al pointed out in this book, Marshall Burrell always had the camera.
Yeah.
Where's that footage?
Where's that stuff? Man, there's a lot of stuff that should not be seen, as we know, as we've heard through the years.
And Daryl,
Al mentions
Daryl, the 5K pulled out for the Sharon era. I'd take that. The Australia show that you can find on YouTube that I think was supposed to be a home video but never really came out. It's a good look. The band looked good. Al was not in the best condition then. How you feel about Gary Sharon's contributions to Van Halen, that can be a polarizing thing. But
was that the show where Michael Anthony sang "Somebody Get Me a Doctor"?
I believe so.
Yeah,
98 in Australia.
Yeah, whew. Yeah, that was smoking.
Well, Steve, thank you for giving your time on a Sunday night. Thank you to everyone who's dealing with us on a Sunday night, supporting us, listening to the rant. Again, we like the book. We just think that there's ways to make it a little better. So
don't savage us like we've seen people say. No, hey,
don't burn DLR book unless you buy the copies. Then if you buy the copies, then you can burn it.
No, we can take it. I give the book 2 thumbs up. It was one of these books, and this doesn't happen often, where I ran to Barnes & Noble at Mall of America, got it, and then sat eating a slice of pizza there. I needed to get back to work, but I read the first chapter. I get home, I sat in the car, I kept reading it. I was so psyched, and I'm psyched I got it. It's a nice addition to my shelf.
Same here. Thank you, Tripwire. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to everybody for the great comments and the questions. And the next time we do this, hopefully there'll be 12 more soundboards from the 80s. Dave the content that doesn't make us cringe, and maybe a couple more Alex quotes that we can decipher.
Yeah, next time next episode, I think we need to pretty much decipher and really take a deep dive into the last 7 or 8 Dave videos. I kid.
Ugh, whatever it is. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.